And we're returning to our main topic of the day, the US resuming military shipments to Ukraine. And to analyze the development, we are joined by Mark Toth, US national security and foreign policy analyst. Good evening.
Good evening, Machi. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. So we know how much emphasis Donald Trump puts on personal relations with various world leaders. Now, do you believe he's really fed up with Vladimir Putin this time?
I think he is. Look, since he took office, Trump has been consistent about one thing. He wants to end the bloodshed in Ukraine. Now, there are multiple ways to get there. And while we can disagree with the approach he's taken to date, in terms of not defending Ukraine enough and giving them offensive weapons, I think the one thing that's been clear is that he doesn't want to see Ukrainian civilians dying. And Putin has pushed him once too many, too far. In this case, seeing civilians targeted is something that Trump has said on the record he's against, and officials around him in Washington, D.C. have been citing that as a reason why he's decided to resume these defensive weapon shipments. So I do believe that it's meaningful and that Trump wants to see this through, and that he may be starting to see the light now that Putin is never going to give up, and that it's really a question of what does the U.S. do to put an end to this war. And you've got to, in my opinion, enable Ukraine to win it.
Well, Donald Trump says Ukraine will receive more weapons, but again, he underlines the word defensive weapons. So why primarily defensive weapons for Ukraine?
Yeah, Machi, I think that's an important distinction to make, because certainly in this package that was held up, as was reported by NBC News, most of those were offensive weapons. But when you kind of dig deep into those weapons, for instance, 92 of them were AIM Sparrow missiles, which the U.S. Air Force doesn't use that much. And so to argue that they're low or something didn't make sense. So what that was telling me, and the withholding of artillery shells, 252 GMLRSs, which are missile systems missiles that are used with the HIMARS system or the M270 launcher. That was telling me that there's more internal debate inside the White House, probably led by a man by the name of Elbridge Colby, in terms of what they want to allocate for Ukraine and what they want to keep in reserve for a potential fight over Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific with China. So the fact, though, that these are defensive in nature, I think goes to the core of what, at least for now, is Trump's messaging, is that he wants Putin to stop targeting civilians. And so that's what you're seeing here. But again, the number of systems, the 10 that he's promising, Patriot systems, is a far cry from the 30 that it was. And it looks like he's trying to make sure that Europe backfills those with their own supplies of Patriot missile systems. So time will tell. But you're key to note that these aren't defensive or offensive weapons going to Ukraine, but they are indeed defensive in nature, which is helpful. But that's not going to stop the drones being launched or the ballistic missiles getting launched. Ukraine needs offensive weapons to do that.
But don't you think that Donald Trump, well, against all odds, is still trying to reach a diplomatic agreement with Russia after his last phone call with Vladimir Putin? I'm referring to these defensive weapons, because if he would say, like, we're sending, long-range missiles that can hit some objects inside Russia, then that would change this narrative. But he specifically says just defensive weapons to protect civilians.
Right. Machi, it's a fair question. I think what's happening, though, is that events are starting to outpace Trump's position on this. And by that, I mean China. Look, the foreign minister was just yet saying, look, we can't afford a loss. Same with Takaja, the chief diplomatic representative of the EU last week in Brussels. They're indicating that just this last several days on the July 4th attacks on Kiev, 5 different Chinese companies, their stamps were found on weapons that were used on the Russian-produced Shahed drones, those Iranian drones, which were quickly sanctioned today by Zelensky of saying. So it's increasingly clear that China wants to see this war continue. They're being somewhat two-faced in terms of saying that they're a neutral and that they want a peaceful ends, it's starting to look more like they want endless war as a way of maybe tying the U.S. down and giving them time to build up their forces if they have to militarily retake Taiwan. So, from that standpoint, I think Trump's going to be faced with a very new reality soon. And I think they are waking up to that. I think the Trump administration in general, Capitol Hill here in Washington, D.C., is also waking up to that fact, and that there's going to be a new reality soon. So what Trump wanted may not be doable anymore, and he's going to have to look at how to win this a different way.
I see. But that can be, a thing of a distant future. Now, what weapons does Ukraine need now? At the moment, given the constant aerial attacks on its civilian infrastructure and the frontline situation, only a while ago we've heard that Patriot missiles are not very effective against these swarms of drones that are attacking Ukrainian cities because, well, they're simply too costly, right, to launch them every time a drone appears on a Ukraine. Right. In the Ukrainian skies. So how to protect the cities against Russian attacks?
Right. No, and you're right to focus on that. Interdiction is the key, and that takes being able to fight a deep fight, is how we describe it. And that takes weapon systems like ATACMS, ideally the Taurus, for instance, that Germany has yet to equip Ukraine with, that can go deeper and take out the Archer. I know Ben Hodges, who's been on TV World quite a bit, General Hodges has stated repeatedly it's important to take out the Archer and not just focus on taking out the Arrow each time. Because if you're using F-16 missiles, et cetera, to take out $30,000 drones, that makes no sense economically or militarily speaking. So you really need to be interdicting from where they're being launched and where they're being built. And Ukraine simply needs a longer range suite of weapons to do that. In terms of interdicting them when they're close to the front lines, to kind of get to the other part of your question there, Ukraine still needs the full suite of weaponry to be able to fight a combined arms warfare. They can't do that yet. Neither side in this war has really been able to maneuver since Ukraine did it masterfully in their opening months of the war, where they took back many of the Russian gains. But since then, this has kind of become a war of attrition, fought along a 900-kilometer battlefront that doesn't move very much, moves a kilometer at a time, because no one can maneuver. And so in terms of what Ukraine needs now, it needs two things. It needs to be able to keep fighting this deep fight, deeper with ATACMS and the like, but it also needs to be able to maneuver in battle, and that's just going to take more air power, more tanks that can withstand drone attacks, et cetera. They really have to think that, because at this point in time, it's just too static of a war. Each side is stuck in a war of attrition, essentially.
Well, maybe the front line isn't moving that much, but on the other hand, Ukraine has resumed its operations in the Kursk and Belgorod regions of Russia. That's the latest. So, what's the purpose of this operation? Because I remember them, basically fleeing from there, right? They had really huge losses in the Kursk region.
Yeah, I would describe the Kursk operation more in terms of how it ended as a tactical withdrawal. At some point when you take land, it's not always to hold it, right? It's to force the enemy to respond, to create a reaction, and for them to divert troops. So the fact that they're going back there is indicative that they're concerned about buildups elsewhere. We recently had the 50,000 buildup of Russian troops in and around Kharkiv. So it could be a bit of that in terms of diverting those forces, diverting them elsewhere. And also it could be a means, Ukraine has done this masterfully in the past, of when they feel that fighting in the Donbass is going against them, forcing the Russians to divert forces from there back into Mother Russia, if you will, so that they can alleviate the current, slight marginal gains, if you will, that Russia's making in the Donbass, in and around the Pokrovsk region.
Now, lastly, I'd like to ask you about recent reports concerning Ukrainian spies and saboteurs working for the Kremlin. Only today there were two such instances. Well, one was the high-ranked military officer who was caught red-handed reporting on the Ukrainian army movement. And the other case, there was a lady arrested in the west of Ukraine who apparently planted a bomb in a hotel. Now, I'm wondering about the scale of this phenomenon. Do many Ukrainians serve the invader?
Yeah, I can't quantify how many, but whenever you have a country that has as many ethnic Russians as it does, ethnic Ukrainians, you're always going to have this. I mean, many have members that family members that live across the borders. They've got family members in Russia. There's lots of pressure there, so the risk is always there, and it's going to be an ongoing battle to do it. I'd like to believe that it's fewer in number than what we see on television, because obviously anytime something like this happens, it's notable, and then you get concerned, could they target Zelensky? Could they take out key leadership in terms of military and the like? But Ukraine to date has done a fairly good job of ferreting out these types of spies and staying on top of it. But I think that's a risk, unfortunately, Machi, that's just going to be there until the end of the war. There's just simply too many people that Russia probably can and keeps trying to recruit from that has ties to Russia.
And they know how to recruit people. Mark Toth, U.S. National Security and Foreign Policy Analyst, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Machi. Good evening.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for much more news and features here on TVP World.